and welcome to the Aspire to Be podcast. I'm your host, Julie Cropp Gareleck. In an 8th grade history class, the teacher had asked us to identify individuals who had integrity. As he went around the room, students blurted out the president and other notable figures. When I was called on, I said my parents. My teacher at the time was definitely surprised by my response, but he smiled and said, "That's the best response yet." That sentiment has rung true my entire life. I'm so excited to introduce our guest today, Mark Cropp, my dad, my mentor, and oftentimes my voice of reason. While his career highlights include notable brands such as Westinghouse or Schindler Electric, he is also known for commercial and real estate endeavors, one of which includes owning the Avenue Restaurant in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's the last endeavor that inspired my first book, Dare to Become, From the Corner Booth to the Corner Office. Welcome to the Aspire to Be podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So there's a lot of ground to cover in just one episode, so we're going to dig in literally and figuratively. So you were 45, which is my age now, when you decided to make a huge life pivot, going from a successful career in the corporate world to literally becoming the chief bottle washer. Tell me what led to this decision to buy a restaurant, and if my memory serves me correctly, one that you had never eaten in before.
Well, yeah, the last part's a good story. I think once you've decided that business is going to be your career, there's a point in time when you get to in your career that you say, look, if I'm going to really reach the pinnacle of being a manager and being a business manager, there's no better challenge than doing it all on your own. Mm-hmm. There was a really a lot of nights and thought process of saying, okay, I'll no longer have the big corporation behind me with their budgets and their safety nets. So even with that, I think everyone at some point in their time, if they're in the business world, thinks about and contemplates the day when they're going to really test themselves and to do it all on their own. Mm-hmm. And so basically, once I decided the business was going to be my career path, I think that's just sort of fell into place as the career grew and the more I learned. I never thought that I would be in the restaurant business. It wasn't something I strove to do. I was basically buying some commercial real estate as an investment opportunity, mm-hmm. and these 3 properties came up, and it just so happened it had a restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at it, and I thought, well, at least there's somebody who wanted to be in the restaurant business. And of course, in my research, found that that's probably the worst way.
Exactly.
Okay, because people, when things get a little too tough and they only have a lease to worry about, they're here one day and gone the next. And now I've got an empty building. Basically, I was traveling a lot at the time of my assignment with the corporation. And my wife said, the kids are off to college. I'm here alone a lot now. You go to work in the mornings at the office and call me by noon, and you're on your way to someplace across the United States. Mm-hmm. Why don't you just pull the pin early, the corporate pin early, and you do it. You can do this, and I'll come and at least have dinner with you every night, and that way I'll know where you are.
Yeah.
And that's how I got in the restaurant business.
Yeah, it's very true. I remember you traveled a lot. I mean, it was 3-4 days a week for the longest time. Probably the last 5 years you were working in corporate America, right? I mean,
yeah, I basically had all of North America, primarily United States, but Canada and Mexico. And while I had some staff that I could send to some of those areas, I pretty much dealt with the United States, encompassing the whole United States. Mm-hmm. And so I got to see the country. I've got a lot of experience in traveling. But there comes a time, I think, when they tired of that, and mm-hmm. You just decide, well, I'd like to be anchored somewhere for more than just mm-hmm. a day at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I think that I know I cover a little bit in the book was really sort of the story to get to the Avenue and to purchasing that real estate. So even though you did have a full-time job working, at the corporation, you and Mom often invested in residential real estate projects where you would come in and you'd take a really broken and a really rundown house and you would turn it into a really beautiful home that you were able to sell. I mean, describe to me a little bit about that. I mean, I know you started that well before you had thought about, investing in the commercial side of it. And you really kind of built your way into that, right? So,
Yeah, it's like anything else that you start out small. And basically, I often tell people, I said, we used to buy things that were just one step better than a good vacant lot. And
so true.
we would go in and we'd take a look at it and thought, well, what if we were buying this house? What would we want it to look like? What would we want to be included in it? I had a hobby of working with my hands in carpentry work, and so I enjoyed it. It became a hobby. So she and I spent a lot of time building decks and hanging kitchen cabinets and
I remember scrubbing walls.
And laying floors. And when it was done, then we would just put it on the market and sell it, and to somebody that would appreciate it and carry it on. So it was sort of a hobby type, make a few extra bucks to put you and your sister through college.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly, again, from that then to buying a restaurant, certainly a leap, right? I think certainly too, as you told and shared it with Marcy and I, we were a little trepidatious in going, well, shoot, is it good news or bad news that he's buying a restaurant? We just knew that it would be a change, but turned out to be a very positive change just in terms of general work-life balance. You still worked the same amount of hours, if not more hours, but you were where we could find you, right?
Exactly. Where I would show up every day at 7 in the morning and where I'd be every night at 10 o'clock when we locked the doors. It was a good thing to bring you back home and settle you back in the neighborhood. Yes, you and your sister were a little apprehensive at first. Maybe Dad had lost something along the way that, he needed to recapture in terms of making good decisions. And some of my fellow managers at my corporate job really tried to talk me out of it, saying that they thought I was really making a big mistake. And so, you have to be determined and not allow people to steal your dreams. And so at some point in time, you just have to step out on faith.
Yeah, no, it's true. We talk a lot about investing in yourself and not being afraid to do so. And sometimes it's, harder at different stages in your life. You were 45, which is where I'm at now. And I, started my business when I was 30. So I'm 15 years in and it still doesn't get any easier. But tell me a little bit about, so you had experience working, in the corporate environment. You had teams of people that you worked with that reported to you. What was it like walking into your first staff meeting, knowing that you were taking over a restaurant that had been in business with the same owner for 26 years? How long was Frank and Jean there?
Frank had about 18 years, but
18 years.
it had started in 1950 with the first owner, and Frank was the second owner. And I basically came to, in my travels, I would obviously hit major cities most of the time, and I would find myself in a restaurant and not remember what restaurant I was in because all the formula restaurants are the same.
Yep.
And I got to where when I would go to New York, I would look for the little family restaurants off the main drag, and I saw so many of my counterparts from other companies doing the same thing because they were just a little tired of the formula. And so this restaurant was so much a part of the history of the town.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, this is what I want to do. I want to make it go back to where its heyday, refurbish the business, not only from the standpoint of the business, but the physical facilities as well. It was a real challenge because I come out of a corporate environment where we have a long history of being selective and having a lot of really great luck finding good people who had vision as what their job was and what they're very responsible and they were you could count on them doing so many things on their own without taking instructions once you trained them. My first staff meeting.
I remember that staff meeting, by the way.
It was, all I could say was, and Frank and Jeannie told me, they said, look, they had been there 18 years and they had allowed it to slip the last 4 years because their kids decided they didn't want to go down that path. So he basically was just allowing others to make some decisions and do some things. And while the core of the business was still solid and the reputation was still solid,
Sure.
it had a few barnacles on the ship.
But as you came in, you had to kind of build on the team. I know there were many employees that had been there for 18 years, some and even decided to stay, right? Even with the transition. And so, how did you approach that? That's got to be difficult to come into a team that were used to the routine they had. There was very little oversight. And then here you come in wanting to implement process and procedure. What did that feel like?
It was rather at times it was overwhelming because the core staff was still very good.
Yeah.
They had been with them, like you say, some of them 18 years, and so obviously those were the people you wanted to keep.
Yeah.
And you wanted to, your biggest challenge was, okay, are they going to see in me what they saw in their former employer?
Right.
Are they going to be patient enough and give me enough time to show them where we want to go? Because I had a definite idea of where I wanted to go with the theme of the restaurant. And I didn't want to run away from what was already established.
Yeah.
I wanted to build on the historic significance of the restaurant in a historically significant community.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to go for the clientele that were like myself, who would go on vacation or go to a business meeting and were looking for a local place where they could go and rub shoulders with local people and look at the local fare. No more of this formula restaurant.
Yep.
No, I didn't want to go down the road and change everything and go into some kind of fast food or some kind of a branded restaurant. I wanted to be unique and one of a kind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think it definitely resonated, right? I mean, not just with the team. I mean, you ended up successfully maintaining most of our employees throughout your tenure while you were there. We did have some turnover because, with anything, there is turnover, especially in restaurants. But for the most part, you had a lot of people that were full-time employees that had stayed with you from the very first day until even with the transition. Some of them stayed once you exited out. But with that also came the customer base. So I know one of the first decisions you had made when you took over was to eliminate the smoking section. Talk to me a little bit about how that went over.
We had to grow into that. The whole non-smoking phenomena I had dealt with in a corporate environment in a large manufacturing facility. Okay, and I had been given the responsibility of surveying the staff and surveying everyone and saying, do we want to go non-smoking? And to my surprise, a majority of the employees at that point in time decided they wanted to go that way. But doesn't mean it was popular.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't mean that it was easy.
Right.
So I had some experience that I brought into the restaurant. And initially we had air makeup units that we could pretty much segregate the two. Unfortunately, you had to walk through the smoking section to get to the non-smoking section, and that was a matter of the facilities. It's just the way it was.
Sure.
So we had gone and maintained that pretty much the first 3/4 of a year, and we had a situation where the one air makeup unit went down one hot summer, and so we were forced to say, okay, no smoking at all. And some of the customers were really upset about that.
Yes.
But initially, when it come time, the system was fixed in a few days. An amazing thing happened in that a lot of my staff who were smokers themselves came to me and says, we don't want to go back.
Exactly.
And so we lost some customers. A lot of them, customers who would come in twice a day and sit there and drink coffee forever.
Sure.
So, I mean, the impact on that wasn't that great. But what we found is we basically had like a 20% increase in business when we did that.
Yeah.
So again, it was one of those things you just sort of walked into that worked out.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it may not be the most popular decision can sometimes be the most beneficial, right? So in terms of growth. And it sounds like from talking to you about kind of your vision for the Avenue, you really did intend for it to become the destination, right, for people. We had a lot of customers that came in once a day, sometimes twice a day. And then we even had families that came back every summer that ate at our restaurant breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I know that was intentional on your part. And what do you think drew those customers back time and time again?
Well, I think it was much my vision from when I decided I was going to buy the restaurant, and that was I wanted some place that people would go and they didn't want to go to the local formula restaurant because they had just been there. They forget after if you have ever traveled a lot, you get into this mode and you forget which city you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted something to be unique and friendly, and where people walked in, um, they knew the staff
Mm-hmm.
because they'd been there forever,
Yeah.
relatively forever,
Relatively forever.
and then the staff knew the people.
Yeah.
And we had people that would come in every year from London, England,
Mm-hmm.
and they would eat there every day, the 3 weeks they were in town.
Yep.
And we had people from the big metropolitan areas, of which we were close to,
Yep.
relatively close to,
Yeah.
that would repeat visitors. That became what we called regulars.
Yeah.
And we basically just wanted to make them feel as though they were at home,
Mm-hmm.
away from home.
Yeah. Well, and I remember there were so many I remember. So we had the Colonel who came in. He was a local regular. We had a group of guys that sat at the counter every day for coffee. There were 4 of them that came in, 1 for hot chocolate, 3 for coffee, 1 being decaf. But there were also families that we watched their children grow over the time that we had it, and they came back in. And I know, even during 9/11, the restaurant became a hub for travelers that were trying to reach their family members. So it really was more than just a place to eat. I think it became an experience for people, and they could come in and chat with us, and we would share our stories. I know they certainly watched Marcy and I grow up. We had gone to college. They watched us make the decision for where we want to go. And certainly I think that's what made it as special as what it was, right? You were able to successfully grow the Avenue year over year. And what do you think attributed to the sustained growth?
I think in any business, and people have always asked me how I could have been involved, because even in my corporate career, I was involved in different aspects
Mm-hmm.
of that corporation and functions in that corporation. But they always ask me, what was the key to your success in so many different areas?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I got to boil it down, you like what's the first 5, or what's the 5 things you have to do to be successful? Well, you can't always, that's not always the way it is, but for me, it was the 3 C's. And the first was clean. And I was big on clean.
Yes, you were.
We had in a restaurant, I thought that was appropriate. And,
Yes.
and we had, even as restaurants goes, we had the most strict adherence to processes and procedures. And a lot of times, if we attracted new employees from another restaurant, our biggest battle was to break them of their bad habits.
That's correct.
That they had learned before.
Yeah.
But clean, and when I say clean, I don't just mean clean the counters and the floors and whatnot, but I'm saying the menus have to be crisp and clean and readable with no stains on them.
The light bulbs.
Light bulbs. You brought that up. You're tired of me hearing me say that, but
I'm not tired. I just remember it.
Success is always really about the light bulbs, which is to say it's about the small things.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the first night when I was going in the next day to buy the restaurant. I had never eaten there before. Okay. And it was just a fluke that I had. Okay.
I had eaten there, by the way.
Yeah, you had. And so I was driving by and I looked at the outside of it, and I looked in there and I counted 13 light bulbs that were burnt out. And I thought to myself, if I drove by and saw the restaurant that 13 light bulbs on the front of their building was burnt out, would I want to eat there? Mm-hmm. And of course, obviously, the answer is no. So when I came in the first day, Adam, who was just started his first day as a dishwasher, I handed him a case of light bulbs. And I told him to turn all the lights on in the restaurant, make sure there's a lit light bulb in each fixture. Mm-hmm. And I got a really strange look from him. Mm-hmm. Why in the middle of the day? Am I turning, or the early morning when the sun's up? Yeah. And I tried to explain to him that's the direction we're going here. It's important to make sure that the lights are always burning.
Yeah. Well, that leads into the second point, which is control, right?
Correct. Control, you have to control your processes. Mm-hmm. And basically, once you develop a procedure, a process that you feel as though is comfortable and you can achieve your goals with, mm-hmm. you want to make sure that process is ingrained in the way you do business. Mm-hmm. In a cleanliness matter, we didn't allow gloves. The state inspectors didn't want us to wear gloves. Mm-hmm. He wanted us to train our staff to develop processes that were easy to control, to certain that they would always have a disinfectant cloth in their hands, and they were always very conscious about cleaning their hands before they picked anything else up. And we achieved that. But that's just one example of control.
Sure.
And you have to maintain that control so that your experience that you deliver, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's the same experience you deliver first thing at 7 a.m. in the morning.
Yep, exactly. And that leads into the last one, which is consistency, right? So
The toughest C.
yeah.
In restaurant business, everybody wants to be a chef.
Yeah.
I found.
I did not want to be.
You did not.
I did not.
So we would have people come from the Marriott experience and educational process, which is by far one of the most recognized best processes
Yes, it is.
in the country.
Sure.
And we still had to take a look at that and say, okay, whatever we change here is fine. Just make sure that, again, that sandwich that is made at lunchtime is the same sandwich that's made at 6 o'clock in the afternoon by the second shift.
Mm-hmm.
And the service you project at the front door.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, how are you doing? Nice to see you again.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. Just make sure that it's consistent throughout, because when you become inconsistent, that's when people get frustrated and don't come back.
And it can be the smallest inconsistency, like changing the mugs. Do you remember when you changed the mugs?
Yeah.
That didn't go over well. We had to bring the mugs back, by the way, but
And it goes back to it. There sometimes it's I remember a time when we were doing a large group, and my Marriott trained chef, who was excellent and really added to the business over the years. He was just super. He was just super in what he added to the success of our business. Had been trained to slice the turkey a certain way, big on portions.
yes,
Well, you're in central Pennsylvania.
I know.
You're in Dutch country.
Yes,
And the people in that area want their turkey pulled, not sliced.
that's right.
And so we learned real hard, fast lesson because we had to repeat the meal at a different time because we had sliced the turkey wrong.
Yep.
So
Such a small thing, but
things.
such an important thing from a local perspective, from a customer base, that we, had to change the way the turkey was sliced. It's so interesting. So, I mean, consistency, so cleanliness, consistency, control, those 3 C's definitely contributed to the sustained growth. I was fortunate enough to have worked there at 16. I was a disgruntled teenager, but I still, came in and worked, and I learned so much about the importance of cause and effect. And I do think that your intention in making sure that we all, not just myself and Marcy or Mom, but that everyone on the team understood the importance of each of those, and that if we weren't, then we would get a different response from the customers that came in. And I do think that attributed a lot to the success in the repeat business, because people wanted to come back in because it was a place they felt very welcome. But certainly, the rise to the top is not without challenge. And we've talked about this ad nauseum over the last 20 years or so. Was there any pivotal moments when you owned the Avenue that changed the way you viewed the business or caught you by surprise?
I think initially, in our first goal was to kind of suppress the slide in the business. It had been on a downward trend, and it's no criticism of the former owner. He admitted that to me when he took over. He says it needs new blood, it needs new ideas, and so the first 12, 14 months, I became frustrated in that my vision wasn't happening.
Yeah.
Was I ahead of the curve, or had I misinterpreted what people would respond to? And shortly after that, sitting in the restaurant thinking, what else could I put in this building? And so I looked at that and I thought, well, I really haven't given it enough time. Most business restaurants fail within the first 5 years, and only 5% survive the first 5 years. So I thought, well, I'm going to give it 5.
Right.
Shortly after that, it took off. Suddenly, I think the whole world at one point in time accepted my vision.
Yeah.
And so it started to happen for us. I think at some point in time, you're appreciative of that, and you want to keep that rolling, and you want to keep that going. But at the same time, you have to understand that sometimes you have to be careful with what you wish for.
Sure. No, of course.
And so without having to, we didn't want to change the atmosphere and the perception of our customers,
Sure.
but we wanted to improve on new opportunities for changing the menu, things like that. And so that kept us busy for quite some time. And to do that, not to get away from who you really were, because I think the biggest mistake you can make in small business, particularly in small business, is to forget who you are and where you want to go and where you came from.
Yeah.
And if you try to be somebody you're not, your customers
they'll know right away.
They'll know right away, and they'll make you pay a price.
Yeah.
So it was always one of those cases where, is this something that's going to work for us? And this is something that I'm going to make a family heirloom, or is this something that's just a business and it's just another part of my career?
Yeah.
And so I think as time wore on, I realized that this was not going to be a family heirloom. I don't think you and your sister wanted to take on the challenge.
It was hard work. And, in hindsight, I mean, obviously it inspired an entire book. So it did serve a really great purpose, which we'll get to in a bit here. But I do think, Marcy and I watched how you worked it. You and Mom worked it full time, 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, whatever it took, right? If we were busy or if someone called out sick or if we had to cover a shift. And I think after 10 years, we saw just how hard it was at our level, and we weren't even running the company. And so I don't think it was much that it wasn't a business we would want to run. I think we were too young, right? I mean, I was, by the time you sold it, I was in my early 20s, still trying to figure my way out. Marcy had moved on to Schindler, where she became an engineer. So it wasn't necessarily going to be something that we took on, but you certainly had hit probably a moment where you knew it was time to get out.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that when I chose to get into this business, I had already developed in mind an exit strategy. And I think people who have not been in a situation where they're planning to going into business think, before I open the doors, I got to have a plan for closing the doors or passing the doors on. And yes, if you're going to go into a business, you're going to buy a business, before you turn the key on the first day, you should have an idea in your head or a plan in your head of how you're going to exit that door. And I think along the way, I had thought about it very hard and strong. I felt this was an established business that had been in this community forever. I'd love to bring people in that enjoyed doing what everyone, the team enjoyed doing, being part of.
Sure.
And someday, having the person, one of those people who'd stayed with us a long time and really made a commitment, would be interesting stepping up in the ownership position. And basically, at some point in time, it comes along when the 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you don't feel as though you're being as effective as maybe you could be.
Sure.
It's hard, okay, because it becomes so much a part of who you are. It's not just what you do every day. You're actually living this business. And so the first thing you want to tell yourself is, I'm so important to this that nobody else could do this. And of course, that's wrong.
Right.
Sadly. But at the same time, we were able to develop a young man who come along and was ready.
Yeah, he started working for you when he was 14.
14 years old.
As a dishwasher.
And I was looking around thinking that, well, when we did this, a lot of the studies said you should change ownership every 8 to 10 years. And we had initially figured it's going to be a 12-year stint, okay, and before we would start moving out. 10 years was rolling around, and we'd had a really busy day. And a young man who had started as a dishwasher, been a
worked his way up,
been a head chef, and he wanted to go out and he wanted to learn the front end of the business. He wanted to learn and he became a server, and just
he and I competed.
Oh yeah,
oh,
and it was amazing the amount of money this young man can make.
I know.
I was kidding him when he was counting his tips, and I looked at him and said, "Holy cow!" I said.
He would rake up. He would just flash a smile and a nod, and these ladies would just roll out the dollars. I had to work twice as hard to get the same amount.
Well, you have to remember, this is sort of a family-style diner, type environment.
Yeah.
Although it was more upscale in that terms, but women were pretty much the norm.
They were, yeah.
You get a young, star-looking man, man, with a great personality.
Yeah.
And boy, the pocketbook's opened.
I tell you.
And he was good at it. He was just really, he had met his place.
Yeah.
And he was counting. I said, "Man, I ought to sell you this place and come wait tables for you. I can make a whole heck of a lot more money." and that sort of stuck. It was like 6 months later, he came to me and he goes, "Mark, I decided I don't want to go to college. I love doing this. This is what I want to do.
Yep.
If I can make it work, can I buy the business from you?"
Mm-hmm.
Big step
It's a
for a
big
young
step.
man of 23 years old.
Yep.
But it was a testament to his capabilities and his personality and his drive and ambition.
Mm-hmm.
He pulled the financing together and bought
Yes,
the
he
business.
did. Yeah, he did. No, and I think what's incredible is, even having watched him, because, he was younger than I was, but we worked together, but he understood what it took, right? Like he understood the work ethic. He understood you couldn't cut corners, right? And I think that was part of the difference. I think also, too, he was really passionate about it, much
Mm-hmm.
like you were, right? People didn't come in just because it was a really great roasted chicken dinner. They did come in for that. But I think it was also, they could sense the energy. They could sense, that we were all invested in it. And all of our team was too. So for him to take it over, was fantastic. And even though there have been several owners since, of that property, it is still a thriving restaurant. It's now Noodle House, which I know you and I had the opportunity of going in and eating for the first time. Just 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, we went in and sat down. And when we went in, we sat there. I know both you and I are surveying the ceiling, the floors, the booths. We're looking for sort of familiarity. But did it make you miss it?
No. I think, first off, your mother always told me that in our 52 years of marriage, that I was only allowed to have one restaurant.
Which is a very good rule.
Yeah. I knew I couldn't afford the divorce, so I figured, okay, restaurants are in my past, not in my future.
Yeah.
And I think that it's one of those things, a business is often one of those places where, once you're there and you pass it on, that there's no going back.
Yeah.
Although there's been opportunities and things to offer,
Yes.
I've done that. I've done that act. Okay, that show was on. It was a success, and it's time to move on to a new script.
Yeah. No.
And so no, I don't really look. I miss. When I walk in, because we had not only rebuilt the business, we rebuilt the building.
Yes, and the brand.
Over 10 years, we had done. We returned the building to its original appearance of 1958, all brand new, but it had that appearance that was such a part of the community. And so when I go back in now, that's still there.
It is still there. The bones are there.
The bones are there.
Yeah.
But it's different.
Yes.
And so it's okay because everybody has their people, have their customers. They've developed their own personalities, and that's fine, even though the tables look the same and the floor looks the same and the ceiling looks the same. It's fun again to see it passed on to somebody else who's making their mark in the world.
No, I agree. I think for me, I think it was hard to go back after you'd sold it only because it had been such a big part of our life, right? It was our life. During the time that you owned it, there's so many good things that happened there. There's certainly challenging things that happened while we were there, but so many lessons that we learned. And certainly what inspired my book, Dare to Become, From the Corner Booth to the Corner Office. I really felt like, whether this was intentional or not on your part or Mom's part, but you really were instrumental in teaching us the foundation of work and work ethic. And I still believe this today, is that, every child should work in a restaurant or in a service business, because I do think it gives you a unique lens into the world. Everyone you wait on is different. Everyone that you work with comes from a different background. And I think that it gives you insights into things like customer service, how to communicate. Do you feel as though that's getting lost in today's, or how can we get back to teaching that? Maybe that's the better question.
Well, I was a big believer when I bought the restaurant that the future was based in your employee team. Not many restaurants at the time were providing health care benefits and paid vacations and benefits, to their employees. I did that. I brought the corporate attitude to the business, and was told by a lot of my competitors that I was crazy. I couldn't do that. But what we were able to do was to build a team who this is more than a job to them. This is their profession.
Sure.
And that shows through to the product that you're delivering.
Yeah.
And so you get that part of it right. It's inevitable that you're going to succeed to some extent.
Sure.
But getting that part correct is very difficult.
It's very hard.
And I too, I've always said, I made you and your sister work a lot harder than any other two employees.
I mean, you did. I mean, at the time, I probably wasn't so happy about it, but goodness, looking back, thank goodness you did.
Well, and I think that, I didn't come out of a high school and go into college. It took me a few years to get around to it.
Well, because your father, invested in your older brother, right? So we've had, if we look at your family, right? So you've got a sister and two brothers. And at that age, at that time, you invested in the oldest male, right? And so he got to go to college, and there was no money for you and your brother. Your brother went into the military, and you went into the workforce. So you really worked your way up from literally the machine floor all the way to the corporate office.
Yeah, and it along the way, I found an employer that was willing to invest in me, and that's how I got my college education in large part. My family was, a lot of people say, well, you try to do the same for both your kids, or all three of your kids, or all four of your kids. Well, at the time, that hasn't always been the same. The firstborn was always the one that sort of went out and sort of hacked through the weeds and
that was generational, right? Maybe not so much true today, but that was generational.
But I was fortunate in having. I think the most fortunate thing that I've had that bestowed on me that I had nothing to do with was having two brothers and a sister.
Yeah. When if we look at your family, and I know we had Tiffy on here, who's your brother's daughter, and we talked about sort of our family, is that you talk about how, coming out of corporate, that's always the goal, to have your own business, but it isn't necessarily for everyone. I do also think that there's a bit of an innate ability, potentially. If I look at you and your siblings, your one brother had successful landscaping companies, and one, owned a working farm, right? A cattle farm for years. They're all very entrepreneurial. And I know that you did have some experience with that with your own father, right? Being a small business owner at a time in his career, not necessarily his whole career, but.
No, he pretty much had a career such as mine, worked for a corporation for most of his career, and then went into business for himself. And so that was sort of inbred in all of us. But I think the path was a little easier for me because I had people who were my mentors. Okay, they sort of blazed the trail. The brother next to me, I think, I was constantly looking to him to see how it's done, and he inspired me along the way. And the same with my other two siblings. But I think that we know families. I do. I have friends whose father was a physician. They became a physician.
Sure.
It's sort of it's what you know, and whether that's your intention to go down that route. And I certainly, at a point in time in my life, I didn't think it was going to be.
I swore I'd never go into business. Look at how that turned out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's so. You go where you're most comfortable being.
Yeah.
And while some people strike out and do something really different, and it's obviously that happens. I think in my case, it was just if you look at my father's brothers and sisters and my mother's, they all had a business. Some part of either part-time, full-time, or dream of being in business.
Well, and Uncle Bill had a flower shop, and I remember as a kid going into the flower shop and thinking, wow, this is so cool. Our last name is on the moniker outside on the building. And at the time, probably didn't put two and two together to think what that means, but that was one of the longest running flower shops in that area, and then was transferred on. They kept the name, so our name stayed on that awning for a little bit longer. But and your father had a toy store, and I know Mom's parents had a gas station and they had their own convenience store as well. So definitely part of the roots, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that, when we, your mother told me, she says, you ought to go in, you ought to just do this business yourself. That night she told me, she says, just pull the pin early of corporate pin early, and at least I'll know where you're at and I can come have dinner with you every night. Because she had a career in banking.
Yeah,
She was in banking. So what she didn't realize was that the history, her family history, would kick in. And yes, she came in every night, but she ended up coming in working her second job.
Yes, she did.
And for 5 years. And after 5 years, she became a full-time employee and joined me full-time in the business. And she had her own business when I first met her. So, I mean, she had that experience from her family, from her background. And so after spending 15 years in the banking industry, she came back home.
Yeah.
So I think that has a lot to play with it. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good business person.
That's a good point.
Else,
that's true. Well, as you look at, folks that are thinking about starting a business, or maybe entrepreneurs that have started a business and are just getting started, I mean, what are some nuggets of wisdom? I mean, I know that the days can be long. I know that the work can be hard, but what are some of the things that you would impart on others who maybe are in it and going through it?
I remember the time that we had started the process of looking for a purchase, someone to purchase the business from us, and I had a gentleman come in with my agent, and he looked around, and he was obviously a corporate guy or a bureaucrat of some. I don't know where it was, but he obviously had a pretty much a 9 to 5, and his first question to me was, "How many hours do you work?" And if you're going to ask that question, stay out of business.
Correct.
Stay where you are.
Yeah.
And do the best you can at that job, because you're needed there. It takes a really good talent to be there and do what you do. It's not a 9 to 5 job. It's not a.
Regardless of what business you start, it is not a 9 to 5.
No, you end up living it. It's your life. It's your lifestyle. Your whole life, social and otherwise, evolves around the business.
Yep.
Because, if there happens to be something come up you want to go do, and something happens at the business, guess what gets the attention, and guess where you don't go. But that's part of it, and you have to be willing to accept that. If you don't accept that it's going to be the hardest thing that you've ever done, keep collecting that paycheck.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing is, I always had stepping out on it is that, it's difficult sometimes when you're looking at doing something and you say, "Oh, I can do this." Well, sleep on it. And if you can visualize walking away from that paycheck that you've collected for 15 or 20 years or even 5 years, okay, that comes every 2 weeks, whether whatever weather hits. And if you can sleep through the night, then you give it some serious consideration. But don't think it's easy. And I see a lot of folks today, they have a love of doing something.
Sure.
Some people love to bake. Some people love to do handicrafts and artwork and whatnot. And sometimes, they don't calculate what it's going to take to make that hobby a successful business.
Exactly.
And you and I talk about this from time to time. The first thing you have to do when you're looking at opening a business is, if your business is cupcakes, how many cupcakes do you have to sell to pay the rent every month?
Exactly.
And can you make that many cupcakes?
Yep.
And it seems like a really simple analogy, but if you stop and think about it, it makes you think about, okay, is this viable? And I think that's the first thing. In my case, we had a viable business already running.
Yeah, and we sold really great omelets too. So you would tell us how many omelets we had to sell on a Sunday morning breakfast. No, I'm just kidding. I joke, but you're right? It comes down to how much of something do you need to sell? Not, yes, I can afford to pay the rent, or yes, I can get a lease on a building, but rather, can you afford to pay for all of the things that come with that?
Yeah, and what's it going to take to motivate people to come to you?
Yeah.
I think when people start to look at going into business, they look at somebody there that's already successful and say, "Oh, boy, I'm going to open that up," and everybody's going to come to me. And my first question to them is, why do you think that?
Right.
Your competitor, okay, and it's good to look at your competitor. I always look at a competitor. People said, "How did you turn that so quick?" I said, "Well, I looked at the person who was number one in my niche, and looked at what they were doing that was right and was working, and I copied it.
Exactly.
Let's be honest here, okay? I'm not some guy.
Executed it flawlessly.
Yeah, and then look at what they're not doing or are willing to do.
Yeah.
And improve upon what they are doing, and that is pretty much as basic as I can get to. Yeah. That's the formula for success. But so many folks go in and think that, well, I can do a better job, and so everybody's just going to stop going to that place across the street and going to come running to me. And guess what? That's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, we hear that a lot in marketing too, where it's like, oh, hey, I threw up a website, so all of these people are going to suddenly find me. Well, much like if you open up a storefront, just because the doors are open doesn't mean that folks are going to come in. You have to give them a reason to walk across that threshold. And if it's a great experience that's consistent, and that they feel that, they'll keep coming across that threshold, much like you guys did at the Avenue. Well, this has been one episode. I know we've packed a lot into this, and I'm sure we could go in many different tangents about what we've learned. Is there a favorite memory from the Avenue?
I think it's the whole experience is my favorite thing. We ended up having clients that were very successful celebrities that when they walked across the front threshold, it was Sam, Paul, Susie, Sally. It wasn't the actor, the rock star, the famous author, the Pulitzer Prize winner, the famous politician. Yeah. And I think my favorite time was when they would come in and sit down and we would all talk just like we were Gettysburg residents.
Exactly.
And we shared a story with one another. And then we got up, and when we walked out the door, they went back to their famous lifestyles, and we were still there talking to somebody else. That was the experience, the stories, the people.
I agree. It's my favorite thing. I think it's the thing I miss too. I love the people. I loved learning. I mean, I know in my own business, I talk a lot about people and understanding people. And I think my curiosity for people started when I worked at the Avenue, because we were very lucky, as you mentioned, to have so many different people come in, but I learned a lot from them. I listened to their stories. I listened to what they had to share with me. And a lot of them gave me some great advice, right? Even as I started my career. So certainly that was a motivation for the book that I've written, and certainly also for this podcast, which is to just continue to tell those stories, because I think it's in those stories that we all find kind of the next step forward. So thank you for joining us for this podcast. Hopefully you'll come back. I know we can't get Mom on here, but well, that was a hard no.
Yes, it was.
It was, yeah.
We won't go back and ask that question again. Yeah. But no, I appreciate you having me. I've often told people, I said, I never had the opportunity to develop an adult relationship with my parents. Yeah. It just wasn't something that was meant to be. Okay, lost them both very young in my life. But I am finding that my relationship with my kids in an adult situation now is extremely rewarding, and we're always here.
Well, likewise, Dad. I mean, you're the first call when there's a problem, unfortunately. But you're also the first call when there are positive things going on.
Yes,
so it certainly, like I said, has shaped up my career, and certainly I know others that have worked for you over the years. But for those of you joining today, I hope if you are in Gettysburg, that you stop by the Avenue Restaurant. It's now called May's Noodle House. It's fantastic. The folks are great. The food is equally as good. But we appreciate you joining us for today's episode with Mark Cropp. Subscribe to our podcast or follow us on www.aspiretobe.co. My challenge for you: aspire to be, dare to become. You might just surprise yourself. Thanks for joining us for today's episode, and we look forward to seeing you on the next.